Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for joining us. I would like to welcome you to this digital talk of the Design and Democracy series at the Design Campus in Dresden. I would like to express my a particularly warm welcome to the participants and tutors of the summer school class 2021 who are joining us from the Museum of Applied Arts in Dresden, Kunstgewerbemuseum, the Pillnitz Park and Palace. So the Design Campus is taking place for the first time. It's the inaugural edition, and the campus is supposed to be and thought to be a curatorial-driven, interdisciplinary and future-oriented platform for rethinking the world's biggest questions through design practices and cultures. And this year's edition is curated by Vera Sacchetti, who's with me here, and myself, Amelie Klein. We are both curators and very honored to be curating this first edition. So the topic that we decided to look into is democracy and design. And arguably, democracy and the crisis that democracy is in is one of the most pressing issues of our times. And while other summer academies focus a lot on making, we were very determined to be very focused on thinking and sharing these thoughts before actually making or doing something. So this conversation that we are about to launch here and now is part of this overall endeavor. And we're really curious to hear from all of you who are joining us and to hear your questions or thoughts after the talk. So design for us is an attitude and a way of thinking rather than anything else. And it's also a way of conveying complexity, the complexity that the world is in and the complexity of the problems that we're currently facing with democracy and other issues. And so this is also the topic of the first week of the Summer Academy, which is a 6-week series of workshops that will end at August 27th. So the first week is really dedicated to tackling complexity and to talking about and thinking about how design can contribute to tackling this complexity. Yeah, and so I would like to give the word to Vera Sacchetti, who will introduce and take our thoughts further and why we have our today's wonderful speaker.
Thank you, Amelie, and hi, everybody. Welcome. I am delighted to be introducing the speaker of our first talk in the Design and Democracy series, Claudia Chwalisz. And it was really for me and Amelie when coming up with the program of this summer school, very obvious choice to invite Claudia. Claudia has been at the origin of all our discussions and thoughts about the interconnections between design and democracy. She has been a long-standing conversation partner, and she has helped us, me and Amelie, to think about complexity and how can design tackle complex systems in novel ways through the conversations we've been sharing. So Claudia Chwalisz, she leads the OECD's work on innovative citizen participation, and her work explores how to bring public judgment to democracy, to improve decision-making, and how to strengthen society's democratic fitness. And over the last years, she's been working on innovative citizen participation, and she has been the lead author of the OECD report, Innovative Citizen Participation and New Democratic Institutions, Catching the Deliberative Wave, which was published in 2020, despite all the setbacks that that year has brought us. And it introduced a variety of innovative ways to think about how deliberative processes can be further integrated and further pushed into democratic institutions and democratic processes, which, as she so kindly reminds us all the time, it's not just about voting in elections. So without further ado, I will pass the word on to Claudia. Thank you so much for joining us, Claudia. And before passing the word on to Claudia, just a reminder to all of us who are watching us that you can submit your questions over the YouTube chat. We will be talking to Claudia after her presentation. Welcome, Claudia, and thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Vera and Emily. Thank you for this really, really kind introduction. It's really an honor to be here with the two of you who I admire enormously and have enjoyed and been so enriched from all the discussions that we've been having also in the other direction. As more of an expert on democracy, you've really enriched all my thinking on design. And really a warm thank you, big thank you to the Dresden Museum of Decorative Arts for hosting this whole conference and the lecture this evening as part of the Design Campus Summer School 2021 on democracy and design. It's really a huge honor and a privilege to be here with you this evening. So I will share my screen here with you. Give me a second, there we go. So the topic connected to this bigger question of complexity, which Vera just brought up, that I'm going to talk about for the next 35 minutes or so, is about creating the conditions for everyday people to be able to contend with and to grapple with complexity in the context of democracy and government, and making collective decisions that affect all of our lives. Questions that have been really important to me in guiding my own work for the past decade or so, thinking about these issues. So how do we collectively solve complex public problems is really at the heart of all of the work and the research that I've been doing, and is the main question at the core of the lecture that I'll be giving right now, to explore in the context of democracy how we could go about this. Because as a contextual reminder, all of this thinking is happening in a context defined by what I would call these 3 Ps of populism, polarization, and pessimism, as well as a context generally where trust in government during the trust in government has been on the decline generally, had a small increase over the past year, but has been going down to these levels of less than half of the population really expressing the trust in the people who are meant to be elected to represent them, to take decisions on their behalf. And so, especially in this broader context of distrust, of democratic disillusionment, of populism, of polarization, how do we take collective decisions which actually garner legitimacy from the broader public, allow us to act and take action, especially when it comes to issues that might be controversial in some ways. Issues such as, for instance, those tackled by the Melbourne People's Panel in 2014. So here we have a group of about 45 people who were brought together through a random selection process, and they were asked to tackle this big question of what should be Melbourne's long-term 10-year, $5 billion plan in the context of having to square a $900 million budget hole. So big issue, complex problem that was put to the group of people here who submitted all of their recommendations to Melbourne's City Council and have been implemented ever since. Or another complex issue, such as those tackled by the Irish Citizens Assembly, which some of you might have heard about. So here we had a group of 100 randomly selected people in Ireland who met together over numerous months between 2016 to 2018 to tackle 5 different types of big issues pressing for Irish society. One of them was about this issue about whether Ireland should change its constitution about the issue of abortion to make it legal. So the citizens that were part of this process, they heard from numerous experts, but also advocacy groups, different people affected by the issue. Over the course of 5 months, they deliberated on it. They made a recommendation to a special parliamentary committee about the fact that there should be a referendum on the issue. But not only that, they also gave very specific recommendations for how the legislation should change should the Irish population vote for a change in that referendum. Another example of a complex issue that has been tackled in a democratic way beyond elections is the French Citizens Convention on Climate. So here you have a group of 150 people who were randomly selected to be broadly representative of French society, and were tasked with the problem by the government of how do we reduce France's greenhouse gas emissions by 40% by 2030 in a spirit of social justice. So they put their 149 recommendations that they developed over the course of 9 months to the government on this question. And finally, another example, a more recent one, is the Canadian Citizens Assembly on Democratic Expression, which took place in the context of COVID. So it's something that happened online, even though it was initially meant to be in person. But there were 42 people who were selected to be broadly representative of Canadian society. They met over the course of 40 hours virtually to learn together, to deliberate in both of the country's official languages, to be able to craft together a complex set of recommendations to the government about different ways to tackle this underlying issue about hate speech online, about creating an environment online that can be free of harassment and be a safer space for everybody to participate, a digital democratic space. And so all of these examples are examples of what are called, in my kind of technical world, of representative deliberative processes, which are designed really to be able to bring in everyday people into the policymaking sphere in such a way that allows them to really grapple with complexity and complex issues, and to have the conditions to be able to come up with very detailed and informed recommendations on what should be done to help tackle them. And so before I dive into some of the statistics and the details about this trend and this deliberative wave that has been taking place, just wanted to take a minute to really define what I'm talking about as, I guess here there's a lot of thought that goes into how these processes are designed in order to be able to create those conditions at the end for people to really be able to put their own personal interests aside, to really understand complex issues and to work together to find common ground. So at the heart of them is a public authority, which has a public problem formulated as a clear task in the form of a question, as in all of the examples that I just shared with you. And they're chosen by a specific process called the Civic Lottery, so that at the end of it, there's a small but broadly representative group of everyday people that comprises what is usually called the Citizens Assembly, Citizens Jury, Citizens Panel. And a Civic Lottery, just to explain what that means, is a two-stage process to select people to be able to be brought into the room. So at the first instance, there's an invitation that is sent out to a completely random sample of the population. And this usually comes from the minister or the mayor or the prime minister, or someone with a lot of authority. And these go out to around 2,000 to sometimes 30,000 people. And those who receive them can opt in to be part of the lottery, because at that second stage, there's a second selection of volunteers, but this time controlling so that that final group is broadly representative when it comes to things like gender, age, location, socioeconomic criteria, and so on. And so in many ways, I think about the Civic Lottery as a sort of ritual of democracy in the same way we think of elections today. And at the moment, it's not as widely known, but for myself, and I think a lot of people who are working in this space of democratic innovation see this really as another way to really enhance democracy by being able to bring in more representative groups of people into policymaking. Because quite often, when that doesn't happen, we know from a lot of research that when things are open, like for anybody to come and participate in a town hall meeting or otherwise, we know that those who end up showing up are not very representative of the wider public. They tend to be much more dominated by men, by people who are well off, well educated, more urban rather than rural, and so on. So really trying to create that microcosm of the population. And then this group of people spends a lot of time, usually around at least 4 days together over the course of a few months, going through roughly 3 stages. So the first being orientation and learning. So there's first a bit of time for people to get to know one another, to set out what values are going to guide their discussions, the norms that will be there to have respectful conversations and to listen to one another. Sometimes there's a little bit of learning about bias and how to identify it and be aware about it. And then the learning is quite crucial. So there's a lot of time actually to be able to hear from experts, to hear from sometimes it's the government officials, to be able to just understand the institutional context, also to hear from stakeholders and advocacy groups. So to get a better sense of the bigger picture of the issue. And once they have that, they also bring in their own personal experiences into the deliberation as well. So deliberation really means a weighing of evidence, of different arguments, explaining the reasoning behind why we think something, with an explicit aim, though, of trying to find common ground, so that at the end of it, it's actually a collective set of recommendations where there's around 80% consensus amongst those people who are part of this process behind their recommendations. So it's not an aggregate of the individual points of view, but it's actually this collective set of recommendations, which is also something that's quite different to a lot of things that happen in our different democratic processes today. And it doesn't end there, though, because the end point is actually the response from the public authority back to this Citizens Assembly, but also the wider public on their recommendations. And so my research and the report that Vera mentioned that was published last year, which I co-authored with my colleague Claudia Chwalisz, is the first empirical and comparative study of these sorts of processes that have been used for public decision making. And it includes 289 examples from 1986 to October 2019. So I have to say, even for someone who's been working in this field for a decade, that was a lot more than we anticipated to find. This trend has actually been more important than I think people realize. The examples come from 18 different OECD countries plus the international level, from all levels of government. We were able to identify 12 different models of deliberative processes. So this is a little bit more technical, but it's just to say that there's a difference between a citizens assembly, a citizens jury, a consensus conference, a planning cell, which have been used in different countries and have slightly different purposes. But all of them follow all of those main criteria that I just described. And then off of the back of all of this empirical research, we also identified 11 principles of good practice. And when I say that there's been a deliberative wave that's been building since the 1980s, it's because we see in the data that since about 2010, there's been really a notable increase in the use of these processes by public authorities at all levels. And what you don't see here is also that we've also been collecting new data since we published this report. And since the end of 2019, there are well over 100 new examples that have taken place since then. So if you see that this graph actually stops at 30, 2020 and 2021 would literally be off the charts here. And so there's a lot of momentum building behind this, and which is also why I think it's quite interesting to be able to understand this phenomenon a little bit better and how it works and the design behind it. We found these examples, as we mentioned, in many different countries. The additional examples actually expand this list, so it's even more diverse. The most examples come from Germany, Australia, Canada, and Denmark, where we have some of the earliest examples as well, and where the origin of some of those models that I mentioned existed. So for instance, in Germany, there's something called the planning cell, which has been used a lot. In Australia, the citizens jury, in Denmark, the consensus conference, etc. We have these examples at all levels of government. So about half of them are from the local level, which makes a lot of sense because there's way more municipalities out there than there are countries. But I show this also because I think sometimes there's a bit of a myth that deliberation can only work at a local level and issues that are closer to people, but actually we have quite a few examples on really large, complex issues that affect a wider population at the national federal level. And even most of those regional state examples come from Canada and Australia, which are both federal countries. And most of the issues tackled there would have been national level issues across most of Europe, just to give a bit of perspective. We were really interested to better understand what sorts of policy issues these processes have been used to address. So the first thing we found was that actually there's a huge variety of different types of problems. Most common ones have to do with things like urban planning, health, environment, strategic planning, and infrastructure. But in doing this analysis, a better way of thinking about it was actually about the types of problems that these processes are addressing. So one criteria being values-based dilemmas. So even when an issue might seem quite technical on the surface, quite often there's actually values that are laden underneath it. So even if you take an issue, for instance, like facial recognition technology, should we be using it in public spaces? That might seem very technical, but actually it brings to the surface a lot of dilemmas about actually what kind of society do we want to have, when or if do we find that acceptable or not, etc. And another criteria was that it's very much well suited for complex problems that require trade-offs, hence why there's a big link to this theme of complexity this week, because it's not really worth time or effort to have such a process in place if there's only a binary choice of options or a very limited set of real options in terms of maneuvering forward on the table. It works well when there's a complex problem, for instance, climate change. There's many different ways it could be addressed, and it's about trying to identify the different trade-offs and compromises involved, the different values of the people in that society and what they're willing to accept or not, and what they're willing to pay or not, etc. And finding where is the middle ground to be able to move forward on it. And then finally, also particularly well suited for long-term questions, like I mentioned on climate, because these processes also help to overcome a lot of those short-term incentives of elections, because people who are randomly selected are not thinking about their re-election in 4 years. They're motivated by the public good and thinking about the community that they're part of. And another key criteria that really makes these well suited for addressing complexity and complex issues is the fact that there's a lot of learning that happens. Experts are really a core part of the design of such processes, which means that at the end, it's also not just people's top of mind opinions on these complex issues that are generated, but actually people are able to arrive at more of a public judgment on them. I mentioned that we have developed 11 good practice principles for deliberative processes. Now I know my time is short, so I'm not going to go into any detail on them here. It's also a bit more technical in nature, but I just wanted to show what they are overall and to point out a few of the key things that we try and really encourage governments to do, because these in a way are the design details that make it so that at the end of such a process, on the one hand, there's a list of recommendations that are generated, which are rigorous, complex, thoughtful, detailed, and could actually be implemented. But on the other hand, it's also been done in such a way that it can inspire public trust and confidence in the process. And the final thing that I want to leave you thinking about is that most of these examples that we've seen so far have been, let's say, one-off ad hoc initiatives that have been rather dependent on political will. And another trend that we're seeing, besides just the general proliferation of the use of these sorts of democratic processes, is actually thinking about how, not just thinking, but actually an implementation about making these more of an ongoing way in which certain types of public decisions are taken. So structural changes to democratic institutions that can improve public decision-making processes and democratic institutions by adding public judgment in an ongoing way. And so there's a new paper that I've been working on for the past few months, which will come out very soon, which identifies 8 different models in which we've seen this happening so far. So it's not a theoretical paper. This is actually quite short and rather descriptive of just what we've seen happening already in different constituencies at different levels of government around the world. And I've personally been involved in some of the small expert design teams and thinking about how do we design these new institutions to fit within an existing system of elections of other decision-making bodies that exist. So again, I'm not going to go into detail about every single one of these here, but I wanted to give you just 3 examples to illustrate what I'm talking about to make this sound a bit less abstract as well. So one of them is called the Ostbelgian model, because it's from Ostbelgian, which is the German-speaking community of Belgium. So a relatively small region, around 80,000 people, but it has its own regional competencies, its own regional parliament. And this is one of the instances where I was involved in the design of this new set of institutions and how they function with the regional parliament there. So in February 2019, this parliament voted unanimously to establish this new institution of the Citizens Council, which is made up of 24 members selected by Civic Lottery. And they have 2 main mandates. One is about agenda setting. So it's up to them to decide what should be the issues that should be put to these one-off citizens panels every year. And each of those citizens panels is also a deliberative process in itself. So each of them has about 25 to 50 people selected by Civic Lottery. They have to have at least a minimum of 3 meetings over 3 months, though it could be more depending on the topic that gets put to them. And then the recommendations get put to the regional parliament, which has to have at least 2 debates about those recommendations and therefore respond to them. So the second role of the Citizens Council is also to monitor that those debates happen, that there's follow-up on what is agreed and what happens. And so there's that ongoing oversight. And it's an interesting example about how we can be thinking about redesigning our democratic institutions, not in such a way that rips up completely what we have and gets rid of elections or gets rid of parliaments or whatnot, but thinks about how we could complement those existing institutions to make them better, to bring in everyday people's voices into the decision-making process, but in such a way which is actually meaningful and allows them to have a genuine influence on shaping those important decisions that affect their lives. So for instance, here, the first issue that the Citizens Council decided to put to a citizens panel was how can we improve the working conditions of healthcare workers in our region? And it was interesting also because they came up with this topic before COVID even. And I think it's a good example to show that you can trust citizens to take their job seriously if you give them the mandate, that they also raise issues which they feel parliamentarians are not giving enough attention to otherwise, but which are important. And allows action, therefore, to be taken on them. Another example of this sort of more permanent change to our democratic institutions is also in Belgium, in the Brussels Regional Parliament, where they have these mixed deliberative committees. So usually in a parliamentary system, there are committees made up of parliamentarians related to specific policy issues that then lead to the crafting of legislation on them. So here, these committees are mixed. So it's a mix of those MPs that would normally sit on that relevant committee, but there's also 45 everyday people from the region of Brussels who are selected by Civic Lottery to be part of it. And the topic that gets put to them can be chosen by one of 2 ways. It can either be initiated by citizens, so with 1,000 signatures bringing the issue to the table, or an MP can also initiate a mixed deliberative committee on a specific issue. And so once this takes place, there are these different stages, as I mentioned, about learning, deliberation, formulating recommendations, and then there's a vote by the citizens and by the MPs. And their recommendations, though, are crafted collectively together and then put to this Brussels Parliament, debated there, and there must be a follow-up within at least 6 months. So they've already had the first one, which is about the deployment of 5G in Brussels, but whether it should happen, and if so, how, different constraints and considerations and trade-offs and things to keep in mind. And there are 3 more of them that are announced and have been initiated, but are either about to take place or will take place later this year. And then one more example to give you another version of this, which is a little bit different. There's something called the Citizens Initiative Review, which originated in Oregon in the United States and has spread to other states in the US, but also has now been tested in Switzerland and also in Finland in Europe. And it's not a process to develop policy recommendations to then be implemented, but it's rather a process that is there to complement direct democracy, so referendums or ballot measures. So here you have a randomly selected group of 22 people on average, and they spend 4 full days, sometimes consecutively, sometimes they're spread out over a few weekends, learning about the issue that's on the ballot paper. They get to interrogate experts, independent experts, to assess the different costs and benefits of the issue that's on the ballot paper, and then they draft a citizen statement, which has the pros and the cons about both sides of the issue, which then gets sent out to every single voter with their ballot paper. So it's a way to help voters come to a much more informed decision before heading to the ballot box and having to vote on what is quite often a very complex issue that most people don't have the time nor the resources, nor, quite frankly, it's quite normal that they don't have the time and resources to be able to do that for every single issue that comes up all the time. So it's a way for everyday citizens to be able to help other citizens come to that more informed point of view about how they should vote. And so given this process has been in place for about a decade now, we also have quite a bit of empirical evidence which has shown that it's something that has quite a lot of awareness these days, and that being part of this has a positive impact not only on the people who are directly involved, the small group of 22 or sometimes 24 people who are part of it, but it also has an impact on the sense of efficacy and agency of the wider public who uses that information from fellow citizens to make their own more informed vote. So by that, I mean a greater sense of efficacy means a greater sense of actually being confident in their own ability to influence change, to influence important decisions around them. So I will end it there. Just, I guess, that my concluding point and thought about this is that these deliberative processes that I've been talking about, they're not some sort of silver bullet or magical solution, but we do have a fair bit of evidence now which shows that if they're designed well, they can bring public judgment to democracy, which can help solve complex problems and increase public trust. So thank you very much for your attention, and I look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you so much, Claudia. That was extremely interesting, especially these latest examples. I'm very curious to read this paper that you're working on right now. One thing that I should say is that if you're interested in these writings and in thinking about these issues, Claudia edits a blog of the OECD that relates to these kinds of issues. It's called Participo, and maybe when we put this up on YouTube after the talk and it stays there, we can add to the description perhaps the link so people can check it out as well. I would like to ask you a question to sort of follow up on these wonderful ideas. Amelie and I will ask a few questions, and then we'll take some questions from the YouTube channel and ask them as well. So if you have any questions, please post them on the YouTube channel so we can see them and ask them to Claudia. I would like to start with this idea of the follow-up with the citizens that are tapped to do these kinds of processes, because you were talking about this idea of political will that exists and that involves these citizens in a kind of a random selection that is sort of inviting people to sort of sign up to these kinds of things. And then these people sometimes are involved in processes that can take up to years or 1.5 years. So that's a really long time. And I believe that research shows that these kinds of processes and the length of these kinds of processes also sort of awakens perhaps a dormant perception in citizens that they are in fact responsible for the making of their democracy and their democratic institutions every day. And therefore, I wanted to ask you a little bit about, I mean, I know there is research that from a government point of view, local, federal, regional, that this really works and that there's a lot of good feedback on these kinds of processes, but I'm more curious about a follow-up at a citizen level. So are these people then tapped again to engage in these kinds of processes? Is there research that shows that they become more involved with their democratic institutions following? And is there research that proves that these processes really change the way that people engage with their democratic institutions?
Yeah, that's a really, really good question. And to me, also one of the most interesting things and why I'm most interested actually in some of these questions about the more structural and longer term changes about making this an ongoing part of democracy, because there is a fair bit of research, even though I think this is an area that requires more research as well. But all the evidence that already exists points to the fact that the people who are brought into these processes, first of all, they're not the usual people who would go to a town hall meeting or who would participate in a traditional consultation or who would be active in a political party. Of course, you have some of those people, but the fact of the Civic Lottery also brings in a lot of people who may have never voted, never gone to a town hall meeting, never been part of a volunteering organization or anything. But it really activates in them this sense of agency and efficacy that I was just talking about. And from my own more qualitative research, having interviewed many, many practitioners and public servants who've been involved in these processes in different countries, one thing that comes up in every country, in every context, at every level of government is just the impact it really has had on the people themselves and how many of them become so much more active in their communities, and also, not just go on to vote and be active in that way, but also, go on to set up associations, to set up volunteering organizations, to just be more civic, and realize just the capacity that they have to be able to shape things and to change things, and that they are capable, and with the right conditions that are designed and created, anybody's actually able to grapple with really complex issues. There's something so powerful about coming to that realization about it. For instance, a couple of weeks ago, I was listening in on a conference that was organized with a few of the people who were part of the French Citizens Convention on Climate that I mentioned at the beginning of my talk. And so one of the ladies was saying that it was such a powerful experience for her that she decided to quit her job, to change what she was doing. She set up a local association to help really share the knowledge with her community about how urgent the climate crisis is and what they could all be doing on an individual and a community level together to help tackle it. And so it really does inspire these sorts of actions. And again, the impact of it is somewhat limited in a way if you just have one process with 100 people that happens every now and then, which is where I see really the interest of the proliferation of this happening at all levels of government on all sorts of different issues happening all the time, bringing in way more people, everyday people, into these sorts of processes over time to be able to scale that impact on the individual. And this is what I mean by that term, a little bit of democratic fitness, of having a society of people who are democratically fit because they're able to flex their democratic muscles and be able to actually be active and engaged and so on in society. So you also asked if they get asked to do this again or not. To me, it's actually the opposite idea of trying to bring in new people every time to be able to expand how many people get to be part of something like this, or at least know somebody who's been part of such a process, because there's also that knock-on effect that takes place as well.
Thanks, Claudia. before we get to the questions from the public, there's already some flocking in, which is great. Please continue. I would like to ask one question about the history of deliberation. We've discussed this before, and you mentioned the Renaissance and some examples from the Renaissance, which is really early. But I would also like to talk about the 1970s, because I do remember that in one conversation, we were at a point where all of a sudden it turned out that the 1970s were also a time where there was a lot of deliberation and a lot of those processes had taken place. And what I would like to know is, how do we make sure that this is not, yet another trend, yet another fad that, because now it's maybe a good idea to deliberate and to involve citizens. How do we make sure that this is sustainable?
It's a question that's on my mind quite a lot. And it's also part of why I feel like sometimes I'm obsessed with thinking about the good practice principles and thinking about the design details of how you do these things, not from a point of view because I just like the boring technical details, but I think that actually, if you don't do this well, it has a big risk of just fueling greater disillusionment, of not actually being useful, of being used to legitimize decisions already taken, which we've seen happen in previous instances in other countries and so on. And so I think there's a lot of momentum at the moment. There's a lot happening. Not everything is being done very well, to be honest. And I think that actually poses a risk to the wider movement if there's too much of that going on. I would say at least the vast majority of this is really being done with the right spirit, the right democratic intentions, and being designed in such a way to really be able to tap into people's public judgment and to be able to actually take seriously the outcomes of these sorts of processes. And so I think part of what would sustain the movement, I think, is the proliferation of this, but actually being done in such a way that more and more people see the value of doing this. And I mean, I think one other thing that comes to mind though is about, I guess how much more of a movement we see towards the more institutionalized approach of making this not just dependent on political will or the one-off ad hoc instances, but something that becomes integrated, so it just becomes a normal part of how our democracy functions and works. And I think we're at the very baby stages of that, and depending on how these first experiments go as well, we'll see if that develops further. But I would see that as a little bit of the tipping point of this becoming something that actually just changes our functioning. And it's difficult because with that happening, it also raises genuine questions though about power and who holds it and who makes decisions at the end of the day. And I have had many discussions also with politicians and also with some public servants who really have a feeling, well, we were elected to take decisions, so why would we delegate that to citizens then? And it requires a little bit of a shift of viewing what is the role of a politician in a democracy today. Also really thinking about the fact that at the end of the day, at the moment anyways, the power stays with the same people, but the process of how they get to the decision changes and becomes a lot richer and more inclusive and so on. Because at the end of the day, it's the decision makers who accept or reject the recommendations, though they have to justify why or why not and so on. So I think it's already a huge improvement. There is a movement within the broader deliberative democracy community, which calls for more radical changes of actually giving these citizens assemblies and citizens juries actual decision-making power so that the recommendations would be binding. We haven't seen very much of that actually taking place. There's a few examples at the local level, notably in Poland actually, where this has happened. But I mean, I think that also throws up all sorts of other questions about legitimacy and accountability and rethinking all of those notions about democracy today. But in my view, those discussions are actually happening more and more often. And I mean, I'm speaking for the OECD, so I'm not going to say we need to get rid of elections or whatnot, but I do think it's interesting to note that these sorts of discussions are actually happening amongst very serious people. So.
Thank you. Claudia, I'll ask you one last question before we bring in the questions from the audience. So we are here in a lecture series that takes place within the context of a summer school that is related to design, and we've met in speaking already about these connections between democracy and design, and I was wondering if you could comment on this discipline that you've repeatedly interacted with. I mean, in the last statement in your lecture, you had this emphasis on the design of these processes. If designed well, they can be very useful. And I was wondering if you could comment a little bit on, coming from the policymaking side, on your views in design, and how can design contribute to this design, not just to the design of these deliberative processes, but in general to the sort of interweaving of policymaking and design. What are the, let's say, porous boundaries maybe between these two?
Yeah, I think it's an interesting question, and I also think this is something that is getting more attention, and deservedly so these days in the community, because I think design comes into it in a few different ways. One is, I mean, as I mentioned, maybe the more conceptual element of thinking about how these institutions and processes actually work, and the details of how you actually choose the people and based on what criteria and how much time you need, etc. Those are design details actually in a way. But then there's other elements of how do you design the space, the physical space in which these deliberations take place. And this is also another issue that I think has been coming up a bit more and more as we realize that actually most of our democratic institutions that exist today, like our parliaments, are not designed in any way for deliberation. They're designed for debate, which is very different in nature. And so actually there's a lack of physical spaces that are well suited to high quality deliberation, where people can talk in small groups with good acoustics and other elements like this. I think there's also questions about design that come into then how you communicate about what's going on to a broader public. I mean, I think I'm guilty of it to a large extent myself, of not always knowing how to translate some of these more technical things maybe into a way that a broader audience can really engage with or understand or get to right away. And so the design can help with that communication about what's going on here in this process. So I think those are a few of the ways that come to my mind. Also interested actually if you have thoughts on other ways you see that in an interesting link.
Yeah, I think Amelie and I see a lot of connections also in the similarity between the processes, especially given the turn that the design discipline has been making away from a discipline born out of the Industrial Revolution and towards a discipline that is mostly concerned with mediation and translation to a certain extent. But I will pass the word on to Amelie, and she maybe can bring in other questions or comment on this answer.
I have a question from the chat, which is particularly interesting because we have an expert in the audience in Dresden, in Pillnitz. Question from the chat: do you know of any example of these deliberative processes in the global South, Latin America, for example? So it's very sad that we cannot add the audience in Pillnitz, because one of the tutors in this week is Gabriela Gomez-Mont, who was leading the very amazing and interesting and wonderful Laboratorio para la Ciudad in Mexico City, who did a lot of those deliberative processes and changed very concrete problems in the city of Mexico, Mexico City. But maybe you have more, since Gabriela cannot speak for herself, unfortunately, maybe you have more details on that or other examples from the Global South?
Yeah, no, it's a shame I can't be in Dresden because I was really looking forward to being able to meet Gabriela. we were both there, but there are a few examples actually in the database update that I mentioned. There's going to be quite a few more than what we had in this initial database, because we were initially looking a bit everywhere. And part of the problem is also just about, I mean, and we acknowledge this in the report and everything as well, that we can't claim that these are the only examples that have taken place. It's based on the most extensive research that we have done, but we're still constantly coming across new things that have happened actually. Some stuff that, well, this isn't the global south, but for instance, somebody just pointed me to 10 new examples that happened in Japan that have only ever been written about in Japanese. And so, there are other barriers, and I'm sure there's actually other examples that we might know about, just a small research caveat about this. What I have seen from my own work and research on this is that in the global south, there has been quite a lot of different cultures of deliberation that exist as well. I didn't go into the details about this, but within this OECD study, our criteria for including an example was somewhat restrictive to be able to have at least a minimum sense of comparability between the different cases. So they all had to have participants that were randomly selected through the Civic Lottery process. There had to be a minimum of 1 full day of face-to-face deliberation, and it had to be something that was initiated by a public authority that would then be able to respond to and actually act on the recommendations that came out of it. And so what we have found from our research, at least so far, is that there are many, many examples in the global south where at least 2 of these 3 criteria has been met, but not all 3. And so there is a chapter in the report where we discuss a large number of them to acknowledge the fact that, the only cultures of deliberations are not the ones that are maybe slightly more formal that we have seen in OECD countries as well. But one interesting example, which is in this new paper that I mentioned about the more institutionalized processes, which I find really interesting, is from Colombia, where they have designed a process of a sort of itinerant set of citizens assemblies, where the first assembly will maybe set the topic. The second one will begin to formulate the wider set of ideas and priorities. Then a new group of people will flesh them out, and so on. And so they're kind of passing on the work to each other. And this is something that has become established in a way that it connects into the city council decision-making process. And so we are seeing lots of interesting experimentations. And I think they're also using WhatsApp as part of their way of communicating and things. So also interesting innovations in how they're doing things too. So just as one example, for instance.
Super. So perhaps one other question would be about the inclusion, really, of citizens. I mean, you mentioned that people are invited through a letter that arrives in their mailbox, but this means that in order to be invited, you need to be part of the system in a way. You need to be registered somewhere. You need to have some sort of legal status. And the other workshop that is happening this week in Dresden, tutored by Studio Low, is also dealing with kind of these ideas of people that are a bit invisible to the system. So do you know of any examples or what would be your opinion about these cases? Because we know that there's several members of society that kind of have fallen between the cracks and sort of do not belong. So they can never be part of these more institutionalized systems in a way.
No, it's a really important question, and actually there's a lot of space devoted to this issue in the larger report as well, because one of the key principles of good practice is also related to inclusion and all the different design choices you can make precisely to break down those barriers to participation and about who you decide actually to be part of the process in the first place. So this ends up being, obviously, I guess, a political choice in many places, but I would say that in most places, the participation is not limited to people who are citizens in the sense of the word of kind of passport holders of that country, but rather residents or living in the place where these processes take place. So quite often, if the process is done by post, it's not actually linked to an electoral register or anything like that, but there's a partnership with the post, which just has all the addresses that exist and completely at random. And so it's also people who are not necessarily even legal migrants who are able to get into these processes in the first instance. There's other things that we really encourage and which are in place most of the time, such as paying people to participate. Not so much that it becomes the incentive for doing so, but enough that it breaks down the barrier for people who might not be able to do so otherwise, providing childcare, providing other caring services, providing transport costs, accommodation if it's something that takes place over a number of days. For instance, in the Brussels mixed deliberative committees that I mentioned, they sent out the letters in, I forget now, numerous languages, so it wasn't just the 2 official languages, but actually they sent it out in the main kind of minority languages as well, knowing that 51%, I think, of the population is not actually native Belgian. And then within the process itself, actually non-native speakers of the 2 languages come with a buddy who helped translate. So I saw some photos actually of one of the deliberations last weekend where there was a man speaking in Arabic with his son beside him, and they were kind of working together to translate and be part of it. So this is also another one of those things which I think really distinguishes these deliberative processes from most other forms of participation and consultation and things that I've seen happening, is that there's really a lot of attention paid to how you design it to be as inclusive as possible. Is it perfect? No, I mean, I think it can always be improved in some way, and it's hard to get everybody into the room. But I think that we have enough evidence actually about what works to really get people to be there, and what can be done to help alleviate some of those barriers. But
we have another question, and I will just read it from the chat. It seems redesigning the process leads to a better commitment. I was wondering if you think that maybe this process could also be useful in structures such as schools or other institutions.
That's also a really good question, and another part of like the broader future of democracy trends that we're looking at with our team at the OECD, about seeing democracy. I don't know, you said design as an attitude, and I think of democracy as a practice, and thinking about the different ways actually we're seeing these democratic principles being applied in all sorts of different contexts. So there has been, I think, more and more experimentation of using these sorts of deliberative processes within schools, actually. So in many countries, there's a kind of culture of having elected student councils. In some places, they've experimented with getting rid of the elections and using the Civic Lottery method of bringing in more diverse students, so those who might be shyer and not willing to put themselves forward, giving them also that encouragement and chance to be part of that decision making at that level. In other institutions, I think there are also groups or it's like organizations that work in this field that work for governments, but also apply a lot of these principles within public company or private companies, I mean. So to aid their internal decision-making processes and so on. So I think some of these principles are being discussed and thought about. And I've recently been part of some discussions with people working, rather in business, who are thinking about, how could we change our decision making with our boards, for instance, applying some of the same principles we're seeing being used within deliberative processes. And so I think the potential actually within the broader sphere of society is still very much untapped.
Thank you, Claudia. Well, I think that we should probably wrap up so that we keep to time. And therefore, I would like to wrap up our conversation by, first of all, thanking Claudia for this wonderful lecture and for the time that you have given us today. I would like to thank our tutors and participants of the summer school who are watching us from Dresden, from Pillnitz, more precisely, and to everybody else who might be watching us today. We will be coming back over the next 5 weeks, always with one talk per week in the Design and Democracy series. We hope you can join us, or if you can't join us, that you watch us on YouTube afterwards. And it's been a pleasure. Thank you once again. And I hope we will be able to meet in person soon for the other 2 people that are in this, chat with me. Yeah, I guess that's what I want to say. I don't know, Emily, do you want to add anything else?
Thank you. That's all I would like to say.
Well, thank you both there, and Emily as well. And thank you to everyone who's watching too. It's a bit of a shame not to be able to see or interact directly, but appreciate the time spent and the good questions.
Yeah. Have a great evening in wherever you are, Pillnitz and elsewhere. And thank you very much for watching and listening. Bye.